Masechet Avoda Zara Daf Chaf Aleph, new Mishnah. We already talked about the prohibition of lo techonem, which literally means do not give favor to the 7 nations in the land of Israel. But one of the dirashot and applications was don't give them hanaya. Do not let them dwell, inhabit, do not sell them land in the state of Israel. And so now we're going to have a Mishnah that expands on that. En maskirin lahem batim be'eretz Yisrael ve'en tzarich lomar sadot. All this is going to be the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who is going to be more stringent than Rabbi Yosef. And Rabbi Meir says one is not allowed, before we talked about selling land, but here it teaches not even to rent out to goyim, houses in the land of Israel, and all the more so, we need to say that one cannot rent out fields. The Gemara will explain why a field is more obvious than a house. Okay, so one cannot certainly not sell, but not even rent out any land in the land of Israel. However, Syria, which is close to Israel and for some things has the same status of holiness as Israel, but for some things a lower level. We're going to see it's a machloket. So according to Rabbi Meir, for Syria, one can rent out a house to goyim there, but not fields. And outside the land of Israel and outside of Syria, there one is permitted to even sell houses, but may not rent out fields, according to the Rabbi Meir. So there is even still some prohibition even outside the land of Israel. Rabbi Yosef Omer. Rabbi Yosef is going to bring everything a notch down for leniency. Be'eretz Yisrael maskirin lahem batim aval lo sadot. In the land of Israel, one is permitted to rent out houses. So you see, houses is less severe than fields, and renting out is less severe than selling. So, and in the land of Israel, according to the Rabbi Yosef, the both leniencies together, that's okay. You can rent out a house, but you cannot rent out a field. Certainly you can't sell any of them. Syria mochrin batim umaskirin sadot ubechutz la'aretz mochrin elu va'elu. And in Syria, according to the Rabbi Yosef, you can sell a house and rent out a field, and outside the land of Israel you can sell and certainly you can rent out anything. There's no prohibitions outside the land of Israel, according to the Rabbi Yosef. Now, even in places where one is permitted to rent out a house to a non-Jew, that is not for them to live in. They can use it for something else. I don't know, use it to open a store or something, but not to live in it, because then we are afraid that they're going to bring Avoda Zara into the house. And now you have a Jewish owner and he's renting it out. Okay, the renter can bring whatever furniture, whatever things he wants into the house, but the Jew is still owning it, and therefore will be responsible if there is an idol that comes into the house that he owns. Shene emad lo tavi to'eba el betecha, as the pasuk says, do not bring abomination, meaning avodah zarah, into your house. Ubechol makom lo yaskir lo tamerchas v'pnei shu nikra al shemo. And nowhere, not inside the land of Israel, not outside the land of Israel, may one rent out a bathhouse, because it is called by the name of the owner. In other words, if a Jew owns a bathhouse, so he can operate it and make a business out of it, or let's say the Jew wants to rent the bathhouse to a non-Jew, and the non-Jew will be the manager and operate it and collect the money and make a business out of it. So the problem with that is that the non-Jew is going to open on Shabbat, which the non-Jew is allowed to do. If a non-Jew owns the property, if let's say he owns the bathhouse, he can open on Shabbat for his non-Jewish customers. There's no problem with that. He doesn't have to keep Shabbat. The problem is that if a Jew owns it, the place is known by the Jewish owner. This is the bathhouse of Mr. Cohen. Everybody knows it as such, and even if he rents it out to a non-Jew, but then the non-Jew is going to open it. But people don't call it the bathhouse of the renter; they call it the bathhouse of Mr. Cohen, and they're going to say, "Oh, look, Mr. Cohen's bathhouse is open on Shabbat." Then they're going to assume that the Jew is operating and opening it on Shabbat, and therefore that's a different problem. So there's actually a number of problems that we're going to see. The main one is lo techonem, inhabiting prohibiting non-Jews in the land of Israel, but this one is about Shabbat, and there are other issues that we're going to see now. Mai en tzarich lomar sadot. Now, how come in the beginning of the Mishnah said, according to the Meir, one cannot rent out a house in the land of Israel, and certainly not a field? Why certainly not? So if you say the reason why certainly not fields is because there are two problems with renting out a field or selling a field. One is that you're giving them land. They're going to be able to encamp in the land, and that's the prohibition of lo techonem. And the other one is that now what grows on that land will be released from ma'aser. If a Jew owns land in Israel and anything that grows on it is holy, and he has to give ma'aser. Once you give over that land to a non-Jew, and the non-Jew is cultivating it, then he doesn't have to give maaser. But now we're lowering the level of kedusha. We're removing holiness, and now there's going to be less maaser to give to the Leviim, to the poor people, and so this is a problem that now he's releasing the land from maaser. So that has two problems, whereas that only applies to a field. And in the case of a house, you have the problem of lo techonem, but you don't have the problem of maaser, because there's nothing growing. It's just a house. If you say that that's the reason why the Mishnah says all the more so a field, but then we can say for a house also, there are two concerns. Number one, giving land to the non-Jews, and second, that now we are releasing it from the obligation of mezuzah. So if a Jew owns it, then he's going to put a mezuzah on it, and now if you're renting it out to a non-Jew, then you're going to not put a mezuzah on it, and so now we're losing out on that mitzvah. So shouldn't it be the same? In other words, both should be prohibited, but why are you saying all the more so? It should be the same. Rav Mishashia says, no, it's different. A house, and regarding a mezuzah, that's the obligation of the one living in the house, not the owner of the house. And so there's no obligation to go and own every house and put a mezuzah on it. If a Jew happens to be living in a house, he puts a mezuzah. If you're not living in a house, then he takes off the mezuzah. So there's no obligation that there should be more mezuzot in the world, and so you don't have to worry about that. You can rent out a house to a non-Jew, and he won't put a mezuzah. No problem with that. Unlike Israel, where we want the land of Israel to have the highest status of holiness, and the more maaser is given, the better. So there is an interest, and you're reducing the holiness of the land of Israel by renting it to a non-Jew who's not going to give maaser. Okay, so we answer that, and in fact, we're going to see in all the examples to come that a field is more stringent because of this double concern than renting out a house. Syria maskirin batim vechule. Now we continue with the next law of Rabbi Meir, who says that in Syria one is permitted to rent out a house, but you cannot rent out a field, and certainly you can't sell neither a house or a field. So there's only one leniency in Syria. Now, what's the status of Syria? Is it part of Israel? Not part of Israel? So right now we're assuming it's not holy, and so what's the reason? How come you can't sell a house in Syria, and you also can't sell a field? Oh, it's because it's a gezerah. If we allow selling a house in Syria, then one may think it's permitted and think you're also allowed to sell a house in the land of Israel. And so that's why there's no selling anywhere, not even a house in Syria, so that you don't come to sell a house in Israel. If so, we ask, then we should also prohibit renting out a house in Syria, because then you may come to rent out a house in Israel, and which is not allowed. So why don't we make a gezerah across the board and say Syria would have the same prohibitions as Israel? And the answer is renting out itself is a gezerah. In other words, even in the land of Israel, the main prohibition of lo techonem is not to sell land or houses to the 7 nations in Israel. That's the main original prohibition, selling. Now the rabbis came and said, listen, don't even rent out a field or a house, because if you rent it out, then you may come to sell it. Okay, good. That's one gezerah. Now we're also going to make a gezerah, just like you can't sell in Israel, don't sell in Syria, because if you sell in Syria, you may confuse them, because Syria also was inhabited for a long time, and as we're going to see, and has the status of holiness for some things. So you might think, if I can sell land in Syria, I may then I'm allowed to sell land in Israel. So therefore we prohibit that also. But we're not going to make a double gezerah and say, don't rent out land in Syria, because if you rent out land in Syria, then you will rent out a house, rather. Don't rent out a house in Syria, because then you may come to sell a house in Syria. And if you sell a house in Syria, then you may come to sell a house in Israel. That's a double gezerah already, and there's no need to make a double gezerah. So that's why in Syria one is allowed to rent out a house. Hold on, if that's the rule, that we don't make a double gezerah, then how about renting out a field, which according to the Bim'ed is prohibited even in Syria? So why don't you say the same thing? That's a gezerah ligzerah. Don't rent out a field in Syria, because you may come to sell a field in Syria, and if you sell a field in Syria, then you may come to sell a field in the land of Israel. So, but we do make a gezerah, so we do make a double gezerah, and the answer is hatam lav gezerahu ka'amar kibush yachid shemeh kibush. No, that one is not a gezerah, because the Rabbi Meir thinks that the conquest of an individual is called a conquest, even though it was conquered just by King David. And it's not a conquest of the land itself, which was by the whole community. And nevertheless, that is called a conquest. And once the conquest is accomplished, then it has the sanctity of Israel applied to it, and therefore there's a direct prohibition of selling a field even in Syria. So there is only one gezerah. You're not allowed to sell a field in Syria, therefore don't even rent a field in Syria. Sadeh de'it be tarte gazru be rabbanan batim delet behu tarte la gazru behu rabbanan. And now you might ask, okay, so then if the land of Syria is holy, then why not make a gezerah? That means you're not allowed to sell a house in Israel, so you should make gezerah not to rent out a house in Israel. And we said, no, we're not going to do that, because regarding a field where there are two concerns, lo techonem, and also now we're not going to have ma'aser taken from that land. There, regarding a field, we do make a gezerah, because in the land of Israel, those two apply in the land of Israel, ma'aser and lo techonem. So, because we have a double concern about land in Israel, there we're going to apply that equally to Syria, because it's so stringent. And then Syria also, we don't want people you can't sell land. And so we're going to make an extra gezerah, not even to rent out land in Syria, because of the double concern. However, regarding houses, regarding a house, is no matter of concern regarding the ma'aseh that's growing. And so we are going to be more lenient and not make a gezerah, although one cannot sell a house even in the land, even in Syria, because Syria is holy. But we're not going to make a gezerah because it's only one concern. According to Bimeir, one is not allowed to sell land to non-Jews even outside the land of Israel. But you can sell houses and you can rent fields. So why a field? Because it's so stringent that there's double concern in the land of Israel regarding a field. So the rabbis make a gezerah even outside the land of Israel when it comes to selling it. Now it's not as stringent as in Syria. In Syria, you can't sell it or rent it out outside the land of Israel and outside of Syria altogether. One can sell land. So there is some gezerah because a field in Israel has a double concern. But houses in Israel only have one concern, lo techonem, and not a problem ma'aseh. So therefore, the rabbis did not make any gezerah at all about selling houses outside the land of Israel. All that was Rabbi Meir. Now, Rabbi Yosef Omer be'ez Yisrael maskirin lahem batim. Rabbi Yosef is going to take everything one level down and say even in the land of Israel, one is allowed to rent houses to non-Jews, but not fields, but you can't sell anything. My ta'ama, sadot bitu behu tarte gazru behu rabanan. Batim delet behu tarte la gazru behu rabanan. Because fields have two concerns, therefore the rabbis made a gezerah. Not only can't you sell it, but it's really stringent not to sell it because there's two concerns. Therefore, don't even rent it. But regarding houses where there's only one problem of lo techonem, because remember, there's no problem of the mezuzah, so then the rabbis don't make a gezerah, and renting it out by itself is not a prohibition. Ube Syria mochrin, and according to the Yosef, in Syria one can sell houses and you can rent fields. You just can't sell fields in Syria. Mai ta'ama kasabur kibush yachid lashime kibush. So number one, the Yosef thinks that the conquering of Syria by an individual, by King David, is not called a permanent conquest, and therefore Syria does not have permanent holiness. Therefore, from the letter of the law, it would be permitted to sell fields or houses. And regarding a field, because it's so stringent that there are two prohibitions in the land of Israel regarding fields, so there the rabbis made a gezerah and said, just don't sell a field in Syria. But you can rent it out in Syria, because we're not going to make a double gezerah. And regarding houses, which has only one problem, even with the land of Israel, the rabbis made no gezerah at all, and one can rent out or even sell a house in Syria. And according to the Yosef, outside the land of Israel, one can rent out or sell and anything of a house or even a field. Why? Because it's far away, so they did not make a gezerah. No one's going to come to think that because you can sell a piece of land somewhere in America, that means I'm allowed to sell a land in Israel. It's far away, and no one's going to come to confuse the two. Amar Rav Yehuda halacha ke'Rabbi Yosef. Shmuel says halacha is like Rabbi Yosef, which is more lenient. Amar Rav Yosef ubilbad shelo ya'asenna shechuna. Rav Yosef says, I understand you're following Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef says you're allowed to rent homes to non-Jews even within the land of Israel. Rav Yosef says, yes, you're allowed to do so, but not so many in one small area that you're going to make a non-Jewish neighborhood. Okay, just one here and one there, but not all concentrated. How many people makes it a neighborhood? Baraita says a neighborhood is not less than 3 people. So you can rent out houses to non-Jews within an area, in a city, a village in Israel, if it's to 1 or 2 people, but already if it's going to be 3, 4, 5, then that's too many. Hold on, if so, we should not rent out to Jews either, because if I rent out to this Jew, he may sublet to a non-Jew, and then the other thing that I rent out to some other Jew, he's going to sublet to 2 other non-Jews, and then before you know it, there's already 3 goyim in the village. So then we should really, to have full control, don't rent out anything to anybody. Amar Abaye, alifne me pakedinan, alifne de lifne la me pakedinan. And Abaye says the law of lifne ve'lo titem mirshol means that directly we're not going to put a stumbling block in front of someone. We're not going to make it easy for a person to make a sin, but we only have to do that at 1 step. We don't have to make 2 steps, and so therefore I'm allowed to sell it to a Jew, and I'm assuming that the Jew will sit and will live there. I don't have to worry that I'm going to sell it to a Jew and he's going to then go sell it to a non-Jew, and the other guy's also going to do that, so I don't have to worry about consequences of my actions that are 2 steps away, but only 1 step away. The Mishnah continues and says, even in a place where it's permitted to rent a house, but that it's not, they can't use it as a residence. Here they're worried about a different problem, that they're going to bring idolatry into it. So now what does this mean? Even in a place where you can rent, doesn't that imply that there are some places where you cannot rent? Right? That's what that implies, that some places are rent, but there are some places where you're not allowed to rent out to goyim. So therefore we see that the stam This line is anonymous, so the anonymous voice of the Mishnah here and in general follows Rabbi Meir, because if it were Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yosef says one can rent a house to a goy in all places, even in the land of Israel he permits it, and all the more so in Syria and outside. So actually there are no places, according to Rabbi Yosef, where you're not allowed to rent out a house to a non-Jew, and therefore you see that the anonymous line here is according to Rabbi Meir, who prohibits renting in the land of Israel. The Mishnah continues and teaches, "Ubechol makom lo yiskod v'chule," and in every place one may not rent out a bathhouse because the bathhouse is known by its owner's name, Mr. Cohen's bathhouse, and then you rent it out to a non-Jew to work in it, to manage it. He's going to open on Shabbat, which the non-Jew is allowed to do, but people aren't going to realize, and they're going to say, "Oh look, Mr. Cohen opens his bathhouse on Shabbat." Tanya, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Lo yiskod adam merchaso legoy, mipnei shenikra al shemo, vegoy ze oseh bo melacha b'shabbatot u'b'yamim tovim. So a braita that explains further that according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, one is not allowed to rent out a bathhouse to a non-Jew because it's called a Jew's name, and the non-Jew is going to open and work in it on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and then people will assume that the Jew is the one opening it and heating up the water and doing the work. So now we ask, all right, you can't sell it, you can't rent it out to a non-Jew. What about to a Samaritan? The Samaritans technically are not Jewish, but they do follow biblical law. They don't believe in oral law. They don't even believe in Nivim and Ketuvim, but they do have the Chumash, more or less the same Chumash as we have, and whatever laws they follow very strictly. There were many Samaritans during the time of the rabbis. And so how about renting it out to a Samaritan? He's not going to work on Shabbat, Shareh, so it's permitted because they also have Shabbat, they also have holidays. Truth is that their calendar is different from our calendar regarding the holidays, but their Shabbat is the same. So anyway, from the fact that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says you can't rent it out to a non-Jew, that would sound like to a Kuti, a Samaritan, it would be permitted. But why? Kuti emad avid be'melacha b'cholo shel moed. He still might have a problem because Samaritan is going to open the bathhouse and do work in it on Chol HaMoed, because the Torah explicitly does not say that you can't do melacha on Chol HaMoed. That's the rabbis figure that out and say you can't do certain melachot during Chol HaMoed. So we should worry about that. It's going to be known as the bathhouse of Mr. Cohen, and you're going to rent it out to a Samaritan. He's going to open on Chol HaMoed, and they're going to say, oh look, they're going to think that Mr. Cohen's doing work on Chol HaMoed. And we say answer that, no, that's not a problem. On Chol HaMoed, also, we can also heat up water for a bathhouse. It's true. There are certain categories of work. You shouldn't do planting and work in the field and general work, whatever it is that you do on Chol HaMoed, if you can leave it till afterwards. So you're not allowed to go make money on Chol HaMoed. However, if it's something that you need on the holiday itself and you want to take a bath, a nice hot bath on Chol HaMoed, so it's certainly permitted to go and make a fire and burn and heat up water and do everything for a bathhouse. So we would also, what is Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen, even if Mr. Cohen opened it or owned it, he could open it and work there on Chol HaMoed. So therefore, you're right. Yes, indeed, there is no problem to rent it out to a Samaritan. Aval sadeu legoy mai shareh mai tama arisa arisute kabid. How about for a field? Let's say you're in a place where you can rent out a field to a non-Jew, and then without the problem that we mentioned before of lo techonem, a place where there's no gezerah outside the land of Israel. So what about that? Okay, you solve that problem of lo techonem, there's no gezerah, but what about the problem that he is going to be working in the field? If you rent out a field to a non-Jew on Shabbat, so the non-Jew said if he decides he wants to go and work in the field that he rented on Shabbat, he's permitted to do so. So why is it permitted to rent out a field? Why don't we say, everybody knows it, this is Mr. Cohen's field, they're going to see people working there, and we'll assume, look, Mr. Cohen has his workers working on Shabbat. So why is it permitted anywhere to rent out a field to a non-Jew? And the answer is arisa arisute ka'abid, because we know that a sharecropper does his sharecropping work. This is a normal thing that if one person owns the field, let's say Mr. Cohen owns the field, and you have sharecroppers. The sharecroppers are working for themselves. They made a deal. They're going to give the owner of the farm a certain amount, a fixed amount, or a certain percentage that they have to pay. But everything else that they grow, they can keep. So they want to work extra time on Shabbat, or they want to take off a different day. So it's up to them whenever they want to work and how much they want to work. And so they're working on Shabbat for themselves. They're not getting paid by the hour. So they're not working directly for the farm owner. That's a sharecropper. And the sharecropper, everybody knows there are sharecroppers on fields, and they're working on their own time whenever they want. And that's why it's permitted. So why don't we say why don't we say apply the same logic to a bathhouse and say, if the people see Mr. Cohen's bathhouse open on Shabbat, why don't they assume, maybe he made a deal with a worker, someone who will open the bathhouse and manage it, and they'll share the profits, and it should be the same thing. And everybody will know that, Mr. Cohen's not opening himself. It's the other guy who gets a certain a share of the profits, and he feels like he wants to open on Shabbat, so he's allowed. Good luck to him. And the answer is Arisat de Merchas la Avdi Inashe. No, people don't make a sharecropping deal when it comes to a bathhouse. It's not common. When it comes to a field, everybody does that because running a field, you could put a lot of work into it, less work into it. So you want to make sure to incentivize the sharecropper. So it's a good deal for the sharecropper. He gets to work the land and get a lot of a profit. And the farmer also, he can't work all of his land. He needs people to help. And so sharecropping is normal for a farm. So everybody will know if they see someone working on Mr. Cohen's farm, those are sharecroppers and they are benefiting themselves. They're not working by the day. Whereas for a bathhouse, people don't usually make that kind of deal. They will assume that these are hired workers, day laborers for the owner of the bathhouse, and the bathhouse is known as Mr. Cohen's bathhouse, and therefore bathhouse is prohibited. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer, lo yaskir adam sadeh lekuti mipnei shenikret al shemo, vechuti zeh obed bo melacha bechulo shel moed. Now a related braita, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says one is not allowed to rent out a field to a Samaritan because the field is called by the name of the owner, who is Mr. Cohen, and a Samaritan, although the Samaritan will not work it on Shabbat and Yom Tov, we don't have to worry about that, but the Samaritan will work the field on Chol HaMoed. And this is different from a bathhouse because a bathhouse, even a Jew is allowed to run on Chol HaMoed. But working in a field, no, a Jew cannot do that. And then if a Samaritan is working the field on Chol HaMoed, they will say, it must be the Jew is working his field on Chol HaMoed. Aval goy mai shared ameri arisa arisute avid. Okay, but you're allowed to rent out your field to a non-Jew. So how come? Well, because then people will say on Shabbat or Yom Tov or Chol HaMoed, he's a sharecropper. He's doing his own work as a sharecropper. Well, then we should apply the same thing to a Samaritan. If someone sees someone working on Mr. Cohen's field on Chol HaMoed, so we can, he's a Samaritan, so we can also say that, he's a tenant farmer, he's a sharecropper, he's working for his own sharecropping deal. So why should we be more worried about a Samaritan than for a non-Jew? So you should be allowed, just like you can rent out a field to a non-Jew because everybody knows he's a sharecropper, you should be allowed to rent it out to a Samaritan because everybody knows he's a sharecropper, and so what if he works on Chol HaMoed? And the answer to that is Arisuta Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar letle. No, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, his reasoning that's permitted to rent out to a non-Jew is not because everybody knows that he's a sharecropper. He has a different reason. Ela goy mai ta'ama mutad. Rather, why, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, are you allowed to rent out a field to a non-Jew? Tamrinan le vesayit. Because the owner can tell a non-Jew, listen, you can be a sharecropper on my field, but you cannot work on Shabbat. And here's my calendar of holidays on Yom Tovim and Chol HaMoed. You're not allowed to work on these days. And the non-Jew will listen. Fine, no problem. I respect your religion. It's not my religion. I'm not Jewish, but you're the owner, and you don't want me to work on these days. Okay, I won't work. So that's why it's permitted, because the non-Jew won't work. Why not apply that to a Samaritan also? That he just tell the Samaritan sharecropper, listen, I know you keep Shabbat also, so you're not going to work on Shabbat and Yom Tov, but listen, you don't have a law of Chol HaMoed in your Torah, but according to my halacha, Chol HaMoed is not allowed. Please don't work on Chol HaMoed. So why not tell him, and then he won't work? And the answer is Kuti la Sayit Amar Ana Gamir Natefeh Minach. A Samaritan will not listen to the Jewish owner because he'll say, I know I'm more learned than you in Torah. The Samaritans, they think that the Jews are wrong and that they're right. They think that they have the correct tradition and the correct Torah, the correct interpretation of it. And so if you tell a Samaritan, please don't work on Chol HaMoed, he's going to say, what are you talking about? It doesn't say that in the Torah. Show me a place where it says he's going to start arguing with you and say it's permitted. Whereas a non-Jew doesn't know anything about Torah, so he's going to respect your religion. Sometimes they have that in the workplace today. If you have a non-Jewish boss and you tell him, listen, I can't work next week, it's Shemini Atzeret. So you have a Jewish holiday, okay, you don't have to come to work. But if you have a Jewish boss, but he's not so learned, and tell him, listen, I can't come in Shemini Atzeret. He says, I never heard of that holiday. I only heard about Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. I never heard of Shemini Atzeret. I'm a Jew also. You're making it up. So you might have a harder time convincing a Jewish boss than a non-Jewish boss. So that's the idea here, that the Samaritan will be argumentative because they claim to follow the Torah, but and they do. They, in fact, know the text of the Torah, but in their interpretation, they don't have Chol HaMoed, and therefore they will not agree with your condition not to work on Chol HaMoed. And now we ask, if so, that the reason that the Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says that one cannot rent out a field to a Samaritan is because he is going to work it on Chol HaMoed, then how come Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said the language because the field is called by his name, by the Jewish owner? Well, it has nothing to do with the fact that it's owned by a Jew and people will think that he's doing it. That was not Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's reason. Rather, his problem was that the Samaritan is going to work on Chol HaMoed. And this is an amazing assumption. We're assuming that we are responsible to make sure that Samaritans themselves don't work on Chol HaMoed. There's a big machlok about the status of a Samaritan. Are they totally non-Jews, or are they actually converts back when? Because they although they converted because the lions were attacking them back in the Sefer Melachim chapter 17. But one opinion says that they're true converts, and therefore they would have to keep the law as Jews. And so we're assuming that opinion. We cannot rent out a field to a Samaritan because then they will work it on Chol HaMoed, and then when we are putting a stumbling block before a blind person because we're setting them up for failure, that we're going to give them land and they're probably going to work it on Chol HaMoed, and so we're responsible to make sure that they don't work on Chol HaMoed, so don't rent it to them in the first place. Whereas you're not going to have that problem with a non-Jew, first because the non-Jew can work on Shabbat, and also because he'll listen to you and he's not going to work your land on Shabbat and Chol HaMoed. So anyway, the point is, how come Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, if his reasoning is that the Samaritan is going to work it on Chol HaMoed, he should say, don't rent it out because that's lefnei ve'lo titen michshol. Why is he saying because it's called the name of the Jew as the owner? And the answer to that is chada ve'od ka'amar. Chada mishum lefnei ve'od mipnei shenikrat al shemo. In fact, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is giving multiple reasons. Number one, you don't rent it out to a Samaritan because lefnei ve'od, and Samaritan is going to work on Chol HaMoed. He's not going to listen to you, and he's not allowed to work on Chol HaMoed. We're responsible to make sure that he doesn't violate that law. That's one. And furthermore, and this Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar mentions this as another reason that it's called by the name of the owner. It's going to Mr. Cohen. He's going to see people working on the land and assume that they're working directly for him, and then that would be a different prohibition. So in fact, both of these apply. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.